Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the next move by Venezuela's opposition and how to fix the country after the Electoral Commission sets forth tough rules that make it almost impossible to see snap elections take place should President Maduro be recalled in a referendum. We're talking about it with Venezuelan author Vincent Oliva, the author of Who Killed Simon Bolivar, Venezuelan analyst from New York, Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez, who teaches at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, is with us, as is from Mexico City, George Chicarello-Maher, author of Building the Commune, The Radical Democracy in Venezuela, and from Washington, Michael McCarthy of American University's Center for Latin American Studies. Now, on the regional stage, before the break, we were talking about Venezuela's the importance for it to be a player, not just nationally, but on the regional level. And now we're seeing that the argument in Venezuela is spilling over to the entire region. There have been moves by Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay to give the Venezuelan government till December 1st before it can assume the rotating presidency of the regional body Mercosur. Also, the president of Peru this week lashing out at Caracas at the annual opening of the UN General Assembly in New York.
Fully fledged democracy requires the absolute respect of human rights, fundamental liberties, and due process. We call firmly and in solidarity for an internal political dialogue to be initiated as soon as possible, without conditions or restrictions, and in a framework that respects the Constitution. Peru is willing to make all the necessary efforts to help our Venezuelan friends find a solution to their problems.
Para que alcancen una solución a sus problemas.
George Chicarello-Maher, is Peru's president a friend of Venezuela?
Not particularly, but we should also understand the broader context, when it comes to what's going on in Latin America, because we have a moment in which the so-called pink tide, the left-wing turn in Latin America, has come to a rather abrupt end, at least as a hegemonic force. And you've got a resurgence of a new right wing that is very aggressively and very sort of successfully attempting to retake power in the region. And the list of countries that is attempting to block Venezuela's bid and term at the Mercosur presidency is really a list of the prime suspects here. You've got Paraguay, the location of an alleged constitutional coup, similar to what happened in Brazil very recently, in which a sort of pack of corrupt politicians displaced the popularly elected president through very dubious maneuvers. And you have, of course, Mauricio Macri, who was elected in Argentina, quite fairly, and yet who himself represents an open and sort of intransigent and hope to turn the region to the right through these new regional alliances, a sort of counter Venezuelan alliance in the region against the sort of Bolivarian alternative that was promised between Venezuela, Cuba, Ecuador, Bolivia, and other countries. And so we're talking about the context of a turning point in which the right is really seizing back power, and this attempt to block Venezuela and Mercosur is an open display of that aspiration, certainly.
Vincent Oliva, when foreign heads of state or government speak out about Venezuela, does that help or hurt the cause of Venezuela's opposition?
Well, that depends, because there's always kind of a double standard. You have to remember, too, that when Manuel Zelaya was ousted by his country's Congress, Hugo Chavez sent, at the time, an infamous Nicolas Maduro to drive a car across the border and try to re-put him in power and take out Micheletti. So it seems like, from the Chavista point of view, if the inherence from the exterior is left-wing, it's good. But if it's right-wing, then automatically, de facto, it's bad. So now that you have a swath of countries saying that they're really worried about democracy in Venezuela, suddenly it becomes a question of nationalism and sovereignty. But when Venezuela does the same thing, or when Cuba does the same thing, it's positive. So you have those double standards that are a central part of the Chavista discourse, and that's the way that they present politics.
Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez, we're seeing, as was just pointed out by George, in neighboring Brazil, the president's been impeached and ousted by the Senate. Yet polls suggest that the left, which also built its legacy there on helping people out of poverty, would come back to power if there was an election tomorrow. Could we see the same thing in Venezuela, where now you would have the ouster at this point in time of the Chavistas from power completely? They've already been chased from power in the legislative chambers, but would come back after a pause?
It's a great question, and I think that the idea that the left would necessarily win in Brazil with an election is complicated by the fact that they have, yes, Lula is probably the most popular candidate, but there's 2 rounds. And so a lot, the actual extent to which PT could pose a comeback in the next election remains to be seen. But I think with Venezuela particularly, Chavismo was always a coalition. One of the things that Chavez did well was he was able to get old guerrilla leaders from Venezuela's guerrilla movement in the 60s and 70s and unite them with more sort of center-left academic types, with military interests, with various wealthy, even old Venezuelan families who participated early on, with various media interests. He was very much of a coalition builder early on. That coalition never really made a lot of sense in some ways. For example, the most dramatic of these is, to what extent is global revolution a priority? To what extent should Venezuela have been giving away money and subsidized oil to smaller countries in exchange for international clout? Those are things that have fomented decisions throughout. But at the same time, Chavez's rhetoric, and there's a lot of it, makes it so that you can probably find something Hugo Chavez said at some point to back any potential eventuality. And I think what Chavez's role will be in a post-Chavismo Venezuela will be more of a Perón figure. It'll be more of a group, it'll be a patronage network, it'll be a symbol, but it'll be both left-wing and right-wing, and it'll probably reinvent itself. Chavez had a daily or a weekly TV show and took to the airwaves constantly. Outside of that TV show, there are countless hours of Chavez talking about pretty much anything that can be cited to back pretty much any idea that any future politician could come up with. So I think that Chavez's role will be largely symbolic, and Chavismo will have various factions. You have military interests, which are very strong right now within Chavismo. Many of the likely successors have some military background, if indeed it turns out to not be Aristóbulo Istúriz in the end. They have a majority of the governorships right now that Chavismo has. So there are very important interests, and military interests tend to not be global. They tend to be more domestic, nationalistic. Then you have economic interests. So I think you will see Chavismo splinter. And in that extent, it'll be difficult to have it create a monolithic recovery quickly. Where it could get interesting down the road is whether that Chavista brand, which, as I said, I think will not necessarily represent what we're seeing now or even what we've seen before, will morph. I think that symbolically Chavismo is here to stay, and will it take over again at some point? It could be. But I don't see that as a likely scenario in the short term, particularly because, as we've seen now, the very siege mentality with which Chavismo is dealing with these threats, with seeing allies in other parts of the country, other parts of the continent fall to the receding pink tide. Kirchner right now is being brought up on charges. So is Lula. It's not a matter of simply losing power. It's a matter of retaining their freedom. So I would expect them to fight tooth and nail to survive. And as a result of that, a lot of people will be hurt. And because a lot of people will be hurt, recovery quickly, I think, is unlikely.
All right, siege mentality, indeed, and it's not just Hugo Chavez that takes to the airwaves a lot. His successor, speaking on television quite often. Here is we're going to listen to, here we saw him last weekend, by the way, showing off his credentials on the world stage by hosting a summit of non-aligned nations. Nicolas Maduro, who addressed that regional row over Mercosur in a televised address.
The pro-tempore presidency of Venezuela in Mercosur is not to be questioned. Now they say they're going to expel us. Them? Expel us? Ha! If they kick us out the door, we'll come back in through the window. No one will take Venezuela out of Mercosur. Venezuela is Mercosur.
Michael McCarthy, let me ask you, because it seems as though the Chavez system now is built on having a head of state that has to be jocular and has to perform.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long tradition in Venezuelan politics of appearing as though you are a strong leader, if not an actual caudillo. And the performance of that role is an important element of politics throughout Latin America. So I don't think things are going to change in that regard. But I do think that Venezuelans have to have a serious discussion about whether or not they want their leaders to promise paradise when it's quite clear that the country has very serious challenges stemming from its dependence on oil and stemming from this recent crisis. Specifically on the question of the international stage, Venezuela has historically played a large role, and in fact a constructive one, in different parts of Latin America and Central America in the 1980s, helping the peace process there. And also, you know, there is some precedent for these oil sharing agreements in the Caribbean with earlier Venezuelan presidents. But I do think that going forward, a kind of Venezuela first mentality will be shaping the agenda of whoever is in charge and running the country. On the international question and in the matter of the sort of reciting of the pink tide, one thing that I think is really relevant just for the sort of realpolitik of the context going forward is that the problem for the Maduro government is that it's going to face a more and more uphill battle at counter-mobilizing when there are attacks against it internationally, like that from the Peruvian president, or maybe new sanctions from the United States government, or problems associated with criticism of its human rights record. There are fewer and fewer people willing to go to bat for the Maduro administration, and the inability to counter-mobilize is a sign of the fact that the government is really on the ropes and is in fact quite cornered internationally. But you know, the question is, this relationship with Mercosur is very interesting, and it actually, you know, if you do a sort of deep reading of what Maduro has said there, he's basically saying that there's a good chance we're going to be kicked out of the body anyway. So, you know, it seems to me that the government is aware of how big the problems are out there on the international stage. And I think it's going to continue to talk loud and speak vocally and coarsely in different international forums, but it no longer has a big stick, right? It doesn't really have the capacity to sort of convene people and impose penalties for not, you know, complying with its requests. I mean, you've seen the Cuban government look after its own national interests, restarting a bilateral relationship here with the United States, and of course,
and buying oil from the Russians.
And that's what I was just going to say next, and buying Russian oil. So, you know, Venezuela has yet to fully accept the fact that at the end of the day, politics is about national interests and playing for yourself, and you have to make your strategic governance plans based on that calculation first and foremost. And that has been, I think, the primary error of the Chavista model from day one.
Vincent Olivier?
Yes, I think it's important to underline the fact that it's not a question of if Maduro is going to be removed. He will be removed. It's a question of when. So what we're looking at is when will he be removed and what's in the best interest for the country. My fears is that in the opposition, I don't have a clear view of what they want to do. The opposition is a mismatch of different people, and a lot of them are doing
how do you buffer this siege mentality that Daniel Landsberg was talking about? How do you make it in such a way that this can all happen in a
Yeah, well, the difficult thing is that you need to have all these reforms put in place, and nobody in the opposition has the real discourse that is, listen, guys, it's really tough. We need to buckle up. We're going to have a couple of years, maybe even 5 years of tough reforms. It's going to be very, very difficult. But in the end, we're going to maybe be back up. Nobody's saying that. Some people in the opposition are saying, like, let's keep the rentist kind of model, the rentier kind of model, and we'll just kind of fix it. And I think that's kind of a problem, too. Nobody in the opposition seems to have a clear path or a clear plan of what they want to to do. What is the role of petrol? As they were saying, what is the role of Venezuela on the international stage? What are you going to do with the universities? What are you going to do with the hospitals? What are you going to do with the people that left the country? And that's not very clear to me, and that's that makes me fear the most.
Nicolas Maduro, himself a former bus driver, so it had to hurt to see them Wednesday protesting in the streets of the capital, bus drivers who reject being labeled guarimberos, or violent thugs.
We don't want the government to consider us guarimberos. We're not guarimberos, we're workers. We're part of what makes the country work, as President Maduro said. We want to mobilize the whole sector, and people working in every sector.
It's getting to be too much. It's terrible what we're living through. Crime and the high cost of spare parts.
We're really not asking for much. We need an adjustment of the fares in order to survive, so that public transports can keep running. Because right now we're losing out and it's failing. And I think that this is what we need most in Caracas and in Venezuela.
George Chicarello Maher, I know there's no silver bullet, but what do you do? What's the first thing you do to stop the hyperinflation, where I think Venezuela is the world's highest inflation rate right now, to get food back on the shelves? What do you do?
Well, I think what the Chavistas do in particular is to put in place a system that will defend the poorest of the poor while you liberate the exchange rate and while you attempt to adjust. And this adjustment is going to be a lot more difficult than it would have been a couple of years ago if the advice of many economists had been taken seriously at that point. But I want to actually kind of agree with some things that people were saying, in the sense that this adjustment will be difficult for Chavistas and for the opposition, and that the difficulties facing the Venezuelan opposition are very similar, in fact, to the difficulties facing the regional right. In other words, those regimes that are coming to power in Argentina, in Brazil, in other parts of the region are very precarious because they don't have a particularly good strategy for dealing with these questions. You see Macri taking some very, very unpopular moves that may not actually, lead to him being in power very long. The Venezuelan opposition, even if it comes up with some strategies and some policies, will need to govern a crisis. And this is, I think, part of the deep read of why there was disagreement about the recall referendum to begin with. Because if they were to win it and they were going to win power in a snap election, they would be dealing with this situation right now. And I think, so just as the Venezuelan government is very fragile at this moment, I think many of these governments that are living through crisis conditions are also very fragile.
All right, it's what you call a political hot potato. Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, what do you think of George's suggestion that you free up the economy, but with safeguards for the poorest of the poor?
I think that given the history of Venezuelan government, it would be very difficult to have a system that did not have a certain amount of government programs aimed at the very poorest. That's something that even the old dictatorships like Pérez Jiménez had programs of that nature. It's very much within the Venezuelan political DNA. It would be very difficult to change. And I think the fact that the government claims that is the first thing that the opposition will do, basically throw all the poor on their own resources, is probably misfounded, and I think that there's probably more of a propagandistic element involved than an actual predictive one. That said, there is a serious, I think, difference between the opposition and the government, which is the government is a bit like a dinosaur that's stuck in a tar pit. And the opposition's more like a hydra. It has lots of heads. It can move around, but it can't decide where it wants to go, and a lot of times the heads sort of snap at each other. The government's becoming more of a hydra, and we can expect it to become so as the threat of a snap election, removing it completely from power, becomes more and more something in the past. It's more likely that we will see government infighting, which I think will weaken the government considerably. For the opposition,
all right, so polarization on lots of fronts. What do you do? What do you do in that case?
So if the opposition were to come to power, I think Brazil makes for an interesting analogy. What we've seen in Brazil is that from the moment that it became clear that Dilma Rousseff might leave, the Brazilian stock market has been one of the best performing in the world. The real is in fact overvalued, if anything, which seemed unthinkable a year ago. Just the market perception that these pink-tide governments might leave is enough to actually be able to strengthen the economic reputation of these countries and to make them interesting for investors. And I think that's something that is often overlooked, that the scenario would change if the faces changed considerably. I mean, look at Argentina. Macri was able to float the idea of new bonds before the old ones that the Kirchner government had defaulted on had even been paid off, just because of the facelift on the government side. There are very low expectations for what the current regime is capable of. With a facelift, that would change. And I think that that's one of the things that the government itself is banking on. That once Maduro leaves, and there was, I think, a very important statement that was made by one of the other guests a few minutes ago, it's a matter of when Maduro leaves, not a matter of if. Whoever the government does put in place, if it's still in a position to do so, that's what they hope to do. Make small moves that will allow it to regain some goodwill internationally, which can go a long way to restructuring the problems. The problems will still be difficult, but I don't think they'll be insurmountable. Venezuela does still have the world's largest oil reserves. Venezuela does still have, for example, a diaspora, which most of the middle class has left, as was mentioned previously, or much of the middle class. But those are people who have been living abroad, who have international capital, have international relationships. In some countries, for example, Dominican Republic, have managed to harness that in a way to make those, and something Cuba's actually done quite well, make those the vanguard on re-engagement. And I think that that's something that the opposition can do, which the government simply cannot. So there are doorways and avenues that open up with Chavismo out of power. And I would argue that the situation facing the government of Venezuela is also largely tied to who the governors of Venezuela are, not just to the external factors. Venezuelans can make their own fate, and to an extent to which, and cutting ties with the past, I think will, or at least threading them a little bit, will be a big part of that.
Michael McCarthy, there's one country we haven't mentioned so far, the United States. How should Washington, what should Washington do? Stay well clear of anything at this point, or get involved?
In addition to the U.S., I think it's also central to talk about China. The Chinese relationship with Venezuela is now institutionalized. That is to say, it's bipartisan. The Chinese have opened a very deep-running diplomatic relationship with the Venezuelan opposition, and I think that Venezuela.
Although of late we've seen Beijing start to keep its distance.
No, I'm talking about with the Venezuelan opposition, which is a way of keeping its distance from the government, but not a way of getting out of Venezuela completely. What I was going to say is that China's investments in Venezuela are part of the country's new normal going forward. I think that there's an acceptance also within the opposition about the role of China in the country's future. Now, with regards to the United States, there's a number of different interests here at play in Washington about what should be done. Some people think that there should be immediate humanitarian assistance dispensed to the country to stem the possibility of a humanitarian crisis and a refugee problem in the Caribbean or in Colombia. Other folks are promoting more sanctions on Maduro government officials. And then there is also a third position, which is essentially that the problem is being taken care of itself by the Venezuelan opposition and by the public's discontent with the government. So best for us to just monitor the situation and prepare for a worst-case scenario. Those different interests, they come from different places, and to some extent they have to do with where you sit. Congress is interested in some parts of the House of Representatives, interested more in sanctions. But I think that the Obama administration, in its final months here in power, is beginning to think about how to turn up the pressure more and more on the Maduro government. If you read carefully through its statements in the past months, you see that they've changed the priority in terms of whether or not they promote first the idea of a national dialogue or a recall referendum. Currently, the administration is promoting the recall referendum as its #1 priority in the country. So I think that there's a possibility for the Obama administration to impose some new sanctions. I think that those would only be slapped on the government at the end of the year, after the electoral processes play themselves out and after the street processes take their form, because the Obama administration doesn't want to be a protagonist in the political struggle between the government and the opposition.
Very briefly, because we're almost out of time, Vincent Olive.
Yep.
The Americans, you like it when they get involved or stay out of it?
No, I don't know. I mean, I don't see the Americans making statements that are out of line towards what any other country is saying. But yeah, I mean, in general, just to keep it brief, yeah, the Americans should stay out of Venezuela in a certain sense, and we should really try and solve our own problems. But it's very difficult to do it without any kind of exterior help, I guess.
All right, I want to thank you, Vincent Olivier. I want to thank Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez for joining us from New York City, George Chicarello Maher for being with us from Mexico City, and Michael McCarthy in Washington. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.